Imagine a place where the morning shift begins at dawn, but no one counts the days, where 247 guards work around the clock to secure not treasure, but silence itself, where the most dangerous sound isn't screaming, it's the absence of any sound at all. Constantinople, 1458. Mehmed II spends $14 million in today's money to build something the world has never seen before. Not a prison, not a fortress, a machine. A machine designed to make people disappear so completely that their governments eventually stop asking what happened to them. 7 towers, 7 wells. One purpose: to transform human beings into administrative problems, and administrative problems into empty ledger lines. This is Yedikule, the fortress where sultans learned the limits of absolute power, where diplomats discovered that immunity has expiration dates, where the Ottoman Empire perfected the art of killing without leaving fingerprints. For over 4 centuries, this machine processed emperors, ambassadors, tax collectors, and religious leaders with the same mechanical precision, same procedures, same documentation, same result, until the empire that built it realized they had created something more powerful than themselves. Today, we're opening the Ottoman archives, we're following the money, we're counting the bodies, and we're asking the question that every empire eventually faces. What do you do when your most effective tool for solving problems becomes your most dangerous problem? The records survive, the techniques endure, and the lessons are more relevant today than they've ever been. Stay with me. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just history, it's a blueprint, and once you see how it works, you'll never look at state power the same way again. The Golden Gate stands sealed, not temporarily, not for repairs, not waiting for the next triumph. Permanently. Forever. A scar in stone where emperors once rode through to cheering crowds. Now the wind is the only thing that passes here, carrying salt from the Marmara Sea and the smell of centuries. Constantinople built this gate to receive gods walking among men. But gods, it turns out, can be inconvenient. And when convenience matters more than ceremony, even the most sacred entrance can become the most effective trap. Look at the Theodosian walls today and you see layers, 3 of them. An outer wall, low and broad. An inner wall, 60 feet of limestone and brick that took 1,000 years to crack. And between them, a moat that once ran red with more than rainwater. This isn't architecture, it's machinery. A machine designed for one purpose: stopping bodies from moving where bodies aren't wanted. The mathematics are elegant in their brutality. Every tower placed exactly 1 arrow's flight from the next. Every gate positioned to funnel attackers into predetermined kill zones. Every stone cut to precise dimensions that turn approach into suicide and retreat into massacre. The Byzantine engineers who designed this system understood something that modern city planners have forgotten: space is a weapon, and distance can kill. But here's what the history books don't tell you. This fortress wasn't built from nothing. It was a conversion. Take an imperial welcome mat, add some walls, subtract the possibility of leaving, and you have created something entirely new. Not a monument to power, but a monument to the fear of losing power. Because the same gate that once opened for triumphs can close for emergencies. And in Constantinople, emergencies had a way of becoming permanent. The year 1453 changes everything, but not the way you think. When Mehmed II takes the city, he doesn't tear down the walls. He studies them. He walks the perimeter like a man examining a watch, understanding how each piece serves the whole, and what he sees gives him ideas that have nothing to do with keeping armies out. 7 towers. That's what he counts along this section of the ancient wall. But 7 isn't enough. 7 is a beginning. So he orders 3 more, each one positioned to complete a geometric puzzle that transforms defense into something else entirely. Something more intimate, more precise. By 1458, when the mortar dries on the final tower, Constantinople has gained something it never knew it needed: a place where people can disappear in plain sight. The logistics alone tell the story: quarrying limestone from the Prince's Islands, mixing mortar with lime burned from Anatolian shells, hauling granite blocks across the narrow strait on barges that cost more than a village's annual harvest. The labor force required to lift stones weighing 4 tons each into position 60 feet above sea level. This isn't construction. It's a statement written in materials that will outlast empires. But follow the money and you find the real story. The Ottoman treasury records, preserved in the archives of the Topkapi Palace, show exactly what this project cost. 180 waros and gold akçes. In today's currency, adjusted for inflation and purchasing power, that's roughly $14 million. $14 million to create a fortress inside a fortress, a lock within a lock, a secret nested inside the most visible structure in the city. Why would an empire spend that much money to build something it already had? Because what they already had was designed to keep enemies out. What they needed was something designed to keep problems in. The first clue to the fortress's true purpose comes from the staffing records. By 1480, the Yedikul fortress employs exactly 247 full-time guards, not soldiers, guards, men whose job description includes a single specific responsibility, ensuring that whatever enters the fortress through the controlled access points does not leave through any other means. Day shift, night shift, tower rotation, gate duty, perimeter patrol. A schedule that never stops, never varies, never allows for the kind of gap where accidents might happen. 247 men to guard what exactly? The official records list treasury functions, gold storage, document security. But treasury records show something else. The most valuable items secured at Yedikul aren't coins or crown jewels. They're people, names in ledgers, diplomatic hostages, political complications, human beings whose continued existence poses questions the state prefers not to answer. The genius of the system isn't the thickness of the walls or the height of the towers. It's administrative. No trial needed. No public spectacle. No crowds gathering to witness justice or injustice. Just a door that closes and a ledger line that ends. The fortress speaks for the state without the state having to say a word. But efficiency requires infrastructure, and infrastructure leaves evidence. The fortress needs water. It needs food. It needs waste removal. It needs communication with the palace. Each of these requirements creates a pathway, and pathways can be mapped. By the early 1500s, the fortress has developed something that will define its character for the next 4 centuries. Routine, morning water delivery, noon meal distribution, evening lamp oil, night watch rotation, the rhythm of maintenance that transforms horror into schedule, cruelty into clockwork. Because the most effective prisons aren't the ones that feel like prisons. They're the ones that feel like nothing at all. The Golden Gate itself becomes the perfect symbol of this transformation. Once it opened for celebrations. Now it opens for deliveries. Once it welcomed emperors home from victory. Now it swallows problems that the empire can't solve and can't afford to acknowledge. The same carved eagles that once spread their wings in triumph now preside over transactions that history will struggle to record and the present prefers to forget. The bridge across the moat, once broad enough for ceremonial processions, narrows to a single controlled span. Wide enough for 1 cart, 1 horse, 1 man at a time. The engineering tells the story. When you control the bridge, you control time itself. Every entry becomes deliberate. Every exit becomes permission. Every footstep becomes a decision made by someone else. Stand at the sealed gate today, and you can still see the slots where the massive wooden beams dropped into place. Iron reinforcements eaten by centuries of salt air, but still functional. Stone grooves worn smooth by the weight of barriers, raised and lowered according to schedules that no longer exist, but somehow still govern the silence that surrounds this place. The transformation is complete by 1520. The fortress that began as a monument to imperial power has become something more useful and more terrible. A machine for managing the impossible, because every empire eventually faces the same problem. What do you do with people who know too much, cost too much, or represent complications that can't be negotiated away? You store them carefully, quietly, efficiently, in a place designed to contain not just bodies, but information. Not just individuals, but the questions their continued existence might raise. You build a fortress that doesn't just keep people in, it keeps questions out. And once that machine is built, once it's tested and proven and staffed and supplied, the only remaining question is, who decides what constitutes a problem worth storing? Because machines don't make those decisions. People do. People with keys and schedules and budgets and reasons that seem perfectly logical at the time. The fortress that began as a gate for gods ends as a warehouse for inconvenience, and that transformation, from sacred space to state utility, tells you everything you need to know about what empires really value when the ceremony ends and the real work begins. Because ceremony is temporary, but convenience, like the stones themselves, can last forever. Now the morning shift begins. Guards emerge from the barracks built into the base of the eastern tower, their footsteps echoing off stones that have heard the same sound every day for 3 centuries. Keys rattle against iron rings. Doors open in sequence, each one revealing another corridor, another staircase, another checkpoint in a system designed to turn human movement into controlled data. The shift change at Yetikul follows protocols written in blood and refined by bureaucracy. Each guard signs his name in the duty log using a cipher system that prevents forgery and ensures accountability. Each key transfers hands with witnesses present. Each section of the fortress receives a visual inspection that gets recorded in detail that would impress a modern auditor. Tower 1, Eastern approach, cleared. Gate mechanism, functional. Water barrels, filled. Lamp oil, sufficient for 18 hours, continuous burn. Tower 2, Northern wall, secured. Interior locks, tested. Prisoner count, verified against ledger entries from the previous shift. Tower 3, Treasury approach, cleared. Document seals, intact. Guard count, confirmed present and accounted for. The invisible chorus begins before dawn. Cook fires in the guard kitchen. Water hauled from the cistern built into the fortress's foundation. Lantern wicks trimmed and oil reservoirs checked. Rope inspected for fraying and replaced according to schedules that treat human life as a logistics problem requiring industrial precision. Because rope fails, chains rust. Iron grows brittle in salt air. The difference between security and catastrophe often comes down to maintenance performed by men whose names history never records, but whose diligence keeps the machine running smoothly, quietly, without the kind of mechanical failure that might raise questions about what exactly the machine is designed to do. The sound design of the fortress becomes evidence of its purpose. Iron on stone creates a specific pitch. Chain dragged across granite produces a frequency that travels through solid walls and announces movement 2 towers away. Footsteps on limestone stairs echo differently than footsteps on wooden floors, creating an acoustic signature that tells the guard in the courtyard exactly who is walking, where, and how urgently they're moving. Every sound carries information. The scrape of a key finding its lock. The thud of a door closing. The creak of hinges that need oil but haven't received it, because the request requires paperwork and paperwork requires justification, and justification requires explanations that no one wants to write down. The fortress develops its own language, spoken in frequencies only the guards understand. A loose chain sounds different from a broken chain. A door closing under normal circumstances creates a different echo than a door closing under pressure. The difference between routine maintenance and emergency response can be heard 3 floors away by men trained to interpret the vocabulary of controlled space. But the most dangerous sound is silence, because silence in a place designed for containment means either perfect compliance or catastrophic failure, and determining which requires investigation, and investigation requires entering spaces that were designed to be entered as infrequently as possible. The daily round begins at the top. Tower 7, the highest point, where a single guard maintains visual contact with the palace, the harbor, and the approach roads that might carry instructions requiring immediate implementation. His job description contains a single line: Observe and report discrepancies. Discrepancies in traffic patterns, discrepancies in routine, discrepancies in the normal order of things that might indicate the need for measures beyond normal security protocols. From Tower 7, the round moves clockwise. Tower 6, documents security and treasury access. Tower 5, armory and emergency supply. Tower 4, primary detention and interrogation. Tower 3, secondary detention and isolation. Tower 2, processing and administrative. Tower 1, entry control and visitor management. Each tower serves a function. Each function requires specific tools. Each tool demands particular expertise. The men who work Tower 4 know things, the men who work Tower 7 don't need to know. The men who work Tower 2 handle paperwork, the men who work Tower 6 never see. Compartmentalization isn't just security. It's protection for the guards themselves, because knowing too much about how the entire system works can become its own kind of liability. The morning meal arrives by cart through the controlled access point at precisely 8:30. The same cart, pulled by the same horse, driven by the same man who has held this contract for 12 years and whose family depends on his continued ability to deliver food without asking questions about who consumes it. Bread baked in the palace kitchens, water drawn from the cistern that serves the imperial household. Meat slaughtered according to regulations that ensure freshness and prevent the kind of food poisoning that might incapacitate guards at inconvenient moments. Even the meals are planned with security in mind, because a sick guard is a gap in the system, and gaps create opportunities for the kind of mistakes that require explanation. The cart returns empty at 9:15. Always empty. Never carrying anything back to the palace, because everything that enters the fortress stays in the fortress until it's processed according to protocols that transform evidence into ash, witnesses into silence, and problems into solutions that require no further documentation. Key control operates as its own economy. The master keykeeper, a position that requires imperial appointment and carries a salary equivalent to a palace administrator, maintains custody of 17 separate keys. Each key opens specific doors in specific sequences. No single key opens more than 3 doors. No guard carries more than 2 keys at any time. The system ensures that accessing any secure area requires either cooperation between multiple guards or time-consuming coordination through the keykeeper's office. But time consumption is a feature, not a bug. Emergency access to any detention area requires a minimum of 20 minutes from authorization to entry, 20 minutes for tempers to cool, 20 minutes for orders to be confirmed, 20 minutes for anyone who might be having second thoughts to reconsider whether emergency access is really necessary. Because the most dangerous moments in any security system are the moments when normal procedures break down. When panic overrides protocol. When someone decides that exceptional circumstances justify exceptional measures. The Yetacool system builds friction into every decision point, ensuring that exceptional measures require exceptional effort, and exceptional effort requires exceptional justification. And exceptional justification requires writing things down that might be better left unwritten. The rumors begin where inspection ends. In the spaces too narrow for torches, too deep for casual supervision, too unpleasant for routine maintenance, rats in the lower chambers, wells that connect to underground streams, chain systems that allow bodies to be lowered into water and raised again according to schedules that serve purposes beyond normal interrogation. The guards hear stories. Stories about prisoners who arrive but don't appear on meal distribution lists. Stories about chambers accessed only by guards who volunteer for extra pay and sign agreements that their families will receive compensation if they die in service. Stories about drowning techniques that leave no marks and disposal methods that leave no evidence and administrative procedures that leave no records. Some stories contain enough detail to be plausible. Others contain enough implausibility to be dismissed. But all stories, true or false, serve the same function. They teach the guards that curiosity about operations beyond their assigned duties is a form of career risk that might prove hazardous to their health. The fortress doesn't just contain prisoners, it contains information. And the most effective way to contain information isn't to forbid questions. It's to ensure that the people who might ask questions understand that some answers cost more than ignorance. Because ignorance, like maintenance, can be managed, but knowledge once acquired becomes permanent. And permanence in a system designed for flexibility represents the kind of structural weakness that empires can't afford. The daily cycle ends where it began, with keys. Keys return to rings. Rings return to locked cabinets. Cabinets secured with seals that will be checked at the beginning of the next shift. The same routine, repeated without variation, creating the kind of mechanical reliability that transforms horror into habit and cruelty into clockwork. But clockwork requires winding, and winding requires someone to turn the key, and the person who turns the key ultimately decides whether the machine runs fast, slow, or stops entirely. That person isn't a guard. That person isn't even inside the fortress. That person sits in a palace 3 miles away, reading reports that arrive daily and contain information summarized according to formats designed to enable decision-making without requiring detailed knowledge of what exactly those decisions accomplish. Because the most efficient systems are the ones that allow good people to do terrible things without ever requiring them to understand what they've done. And understanding, like the prisoners themselves, is something that can be contained as long as the containers remain secure and the schedules remain reliable, and the maintenance continues without interruption. Tomorrow the shift will change again. The same keys, the same rounds, the same reports, the same silence that surrounds questions no one asks about operations, no one discusses in service of goals, no one questions, and the fortress will continue functioning exactly as designed, quietly, efficiently, without drama or spectacle or any of the inconvenient complications that arise when machines designed for containing problems become problems themselves. Because the best machines are the ones that solve problems so completely that people forget the problems ever existed in the first place. The damp rises from below like a living thing, not the clean dampness of morning dew or seasonal rain, but something older and more persistent, something that seeps through limestone blocks and mortar joints and iron fittings, carrying with it the accumulated moisture of centuries and the particular chemistry of fear. Constantinople's climate conspires with the fortress architecture to create conditions that assault the human body without requiring human intervention. Salt air from the Marmara Sea crystallizes in the mortar between stones, expanding and contracting with temperature changes that gradually widen cracks and create pathways for water infiltration. Winter freeze cycles burst the cells of saturated limestone, creating a slow-motion explosion that weakens walls and creates the kind of structural instability that makes chambers unsafe for extended occupation. But extended occupation continues anyway, because structural safety is a luxury that conflicts with the primary function of containment. The building science of confinement operates according to principles that predate modern understanding of human psychology, but achieve effects that modern interrogators would recognize and admire. Darkness that persists beyond normal sleep cycles, disrupting circadian rhythms and creating the kind of temporal disorientation that makes accurate memory formation nearly impossible. Humidity levels that encourage the growth of molds whose spores affect respiratory function and cognitive performance. Temperature variations that prevent the deep sleep necessary for psychological resilience. Your cell breathes against you. Condensation forms on stone walls during the day and evaporates at night, creating a cycle of dampness and drying that produces acoustic effects that sound like whispers when no one is speaking. The limestone itself sweats minerals that leave white stains on surfaces and create textures that feel organic under hands desperate for any sensory input that confirms the continued existence of the physical world. The rats arrive not as invaders, but as colonists, establishing territories in the spaces between human occupation and structural decay. Their presence serves functions beyond mere infestation. Rats consume food waste that might otherwise attract larger scavengers. They disturb the sleep of prisoners in ways that require no guard intervention. Their sounds create audio signatures that mask other sounds, providing acoustic cover for activities that benefit from not being overheard. But rats also serve as early warning systems. Their behavior changes in response to structural problems, human illness, and atmospheric variations that might indicate the need for maintenance or medical intervention. A chamber without rats is a chamber with problems that require investigation. A chamber with too many rats is a chamber where containment has failed and cleanup will be necessary. The guards learn to read rat behavior like a text written in motion and silence. Rats fleeing a particular area indicate flood risk or structural collapse. Rats gathering in unusual numbers suggest the presence of something that attracts scavengers. Rats avoiding areas they previously occupied might indicate chemical contamination or the kind of disease outbreak that could spread beyond the prisoner population into the guard staff. Because the fortress exists in a delicate ecological balance between human control and natural decay, and maintaining that balance requires understanding the signs that indicate when intervention is necessary and when intervention might create more problems than it solves. The wells that give the fortress its name, Yeti-Cool, 7 towers, 7 wells, represent engineering solutions to problems that reveal the true scope of the operation. Wells require maintenance. Wells require access. Wells require disposal protocols that transform evidence into absence and witnesses into statistics that appear nowhere in official records. The engineering specifications survive in Ottoman archives that were never intended for public access. 7 wells, ranging in depth from 40 feet to 80 feet, stone-lined shafts connected to underground streams that flow toward the Marmara Sea. Drainage capacity sufficient to handle approximately 400 cubic feet of material per day during normal flow conditions. Pulleys and chain systems rated for loads of up to 200 pounds, with redundant mechanisms that ensure operational reliability even under emergency conditions. Emergency conditions. The phrase appears in maintenance records without explanation or elaboration, as if the nature of emergencies that might require emergency disposal procedures is self-evident to anyone with clearance to read the records in the first place. But the most revealing detail in the engineering specifications isn't about capacity or drainage or mechanical systems. It's about timing. The wells are designed to operate silently, pulleys mounted in housings that muffle the sound of chains. Stone covers that fit precisely enough to prevent echoes from rising to surface level. Drainage systems that ensure rapid flow without the kind of backup or overflow that might create evidence at inconvenient locations. Silent operation indicates awareness that the wells serve functions that benefit from not being heard, functions that require the kind of discretion that transforms operational necessity into state secret and state secret into the kind of knowledge that carries its own dangers for anyone who acquires too much of it. The psychological architecture of the fortress operates on principles that maximize disorientation while minimizing the kind of obvious brutality that might generate sympathy or political complications. Corridors that lead to dead ends without warning. Stairways that ascend to doors that open onto empty space. Chambers sized to prevent comfortable sitting or lying, but too small to allow normal standing height. Time collapses in rooms without windows, without natural light to mark the passage of days, without meals delivered on regular schedules, without any external reference point that confirms the continued existence of a world beyond stone walls. The human mind begins to doubt its own capacity for accurate perception. Minutes feel like hours. Hours feel like minutes. Sleep becomes indistinguishable from unconsciousness. Unconsciousness becomes indistinguishable from death. The fortress kills without touching, tortures without leaving marks, destroys sanity without requiring any tools more sophisticated than stone, iron, and the patient application of architectural principles that treat human psychology as an engineering problem. But the most insidious feature of the psychological environment isn't the disorientation or the sensory deprivation or the carefully calibrated discomfort. It's hope, because hope, properly managed, can be more destructive than despair. The fortress provides just enough comfort to sustain life and just enough routine to suggest the possibility of change. Meals that vary slightly in composition, creating the illusion that someone, somewhere, is making decisions about your welfare. sounds from the outside world that penetrate the walls just frequently enough to confirm that the outside world continues to exist. Glimpses of sky through narrow windows positioned to be visible from certain angles at certain times of day. Hope that tomorrow might bring different treatment. Hope that your case might be reviewed. Hope that political circumstances might change in ways that affect your status. Hope that someone knows where you are and might be working toward your release. Hope sustained at precisely the level necessary to prevent the kind of complete despair that might lead to suicide, and the administrative complications that suicide creates for guards who are required to deliver living prisoners to whatever destination the prisoners are ultimately intended to reach, because suicide represents system failure. Suicide raises questions about conditions and treatment and operational procedures. Suicide requires explanations that involve people who might not have authorized the operations that made explanation necessary. The fortress teaches its inhabitants that survival requires cooperation. Cooperation requires compliance, and compliance requires accepting conditions that no human being should be expected to accept. But acceptance, once achieved, becomes a form of collaboration that makes resistance feel like betrayal of the very hope that made survival possible in the first place. And betrayal, whether of hope or resistance or the people who might be depending on your continued existence, creates the kind of psychological damage that persists long after the physical imprisonment ends. If physical imprisonment ever ends. Because the most effective prisons are the ones that continue operating inside the minds of their former inmates, creating portable confinement that requires no walls and no guards, and no maintenance beyond the normal operations of memory and guilt, and the terrible knowledge of what human beings will do to other human beings when they believe no one is watching and no one will be held accountable. The fortress serves diplomatic functions that transform imprisonment into communication and individual suffering into political messaging. Foreign envoys who displease the Sultan don't simply disappear. They are held under conditions that can be described to their governments with whatever degree of accuracy serves Ottoman interests at any particular moment. Comfortable imprisonment sends one message. Harsh imprisonment sends another message. The gradual deterioration of conditions over time sends a third message that combines the first two with an element of temporal urgency designed to encourage rapid policy changes in directions favorable to Ottoman objectives. The envoy from Venice who arrives in chains but receives decent food and writing materials understands that his situation might improve based on Venetian cooperation with Ottoman trade policy. The envoy from Genoa who arrives with ceremony but loses privileges over time understands that Genoese resistance to Ottoman expansion carries personal consequences for him specifically. But the envoy who simply vanishes, who enters the fortress and then disappears from all diplomatic correspondence as if he never existed, sends the most powerful message of all. Not a threat, a demonstration. Proof that Ottoman power includes the ability to erase people so completely that their governments eventually stop asking what happened to them. Protocol clash becomes its own form of torture when implemented systematically. How do you imprison a man who represents a sovereign state without committing an act of war? How do you treat him with the dignity his status demands while simultaneously demonstrating that his status provides no protection from Ottoman displeasure? The answer lies in administrative creativity. The envoy receives treatment appropriate to his rank. Excellent food, comfortable quarters, access to writing materials, permission to receive visitors and send letters. But the excellent food arrives on unpredictable schedules. The comfortable quarters are changed without notice or explanation. The writing materials disappear and reappear according to no discernible pattern. The visitors are permitted or denied access based on criteria that shift without warning. The envoy learns that his dignity exists only as long as it serves Ottoman convenience. His status protects him only when protection aligns with Ottoman interests. His government's ability to secure his release depends entirely on Ottoman willingness to acknowledge his continued existence. And acknowledgement, like every other aspect of diplomatic imprisonment, becomes a negotiating tool that can be deployed or withdrawn based on factors that have nothing to do with the envoy's individual conduct or personal circumstances. The fortress becomes a library of diplomatic leverage. Each prisoner represents a different form of pressure that can be applied to foreign governments. Each change in conditions sends a signal that can be interpreted as encouragement or warning. Each release or transfer or termination of imprisonment creates precedents that inform future diplomatic calculations about the costs and benefits of opposition to Ottoman policy. But the most valuable aspect of diplomatic imprisonment isn't the pressure it applies to foreign governments. It's the education it provides to Ottoman officials about the effectiveness of controlled suffering as a tool of statecraft. Because officials who learn to use imprisonment as diplomacy eventually discover that the same techniques work equally well on domestic problems. Political opponents who resist Ottoman policy can be treated like foreign envoys who displease Ottoman interests. Domestic critics who raise inconvenient questions can be subjected to the same administrative creativity that proves so effective against Venetian ambassadors and Genoese merchants. The fortress that begins as a tool for managing external relationships gradually evolves into a tool for managing internal relationships. The expertise developed through diplomatic imprisonment becomes applicable to any situation where traditional methods of persuasion prove insufficient and alternative methods of encouragement need to be explored. And exploration, in the context of state power, tends to push boundaries toward territories that were previously considered off-limits for reasons that eventually seem less compelling than the immediate benefits of expanded operational flexibility. The palace begins to discover problems that can only be solved by the kind of specialized expertise that the fortress has developed through its diplomatic operations. Problems that require discretion, problems that require expertise, problems that require the kind of institutional knowledge that comes only from sustained experience with controlled suffering and administrative disappearance. Problems like popular discontent, problems like economic criticism, problems like religious dissent that challenges state authority, problems like military reform that threatens traditional arrangements between the palace and the armed forces, problems like a young sultan who develops ideas about governance that conflict with the interests of people who have grown comfortable with existing arrangements and possess both the motivation and the institutional capacity to demonstrate why change can be dangerous for everyone involved, including the person advocating for change. The fortress that was built to secure treasure has learned to treat people as treasure. The fortress that was designed to protect state interests has learned to define state interests in terms of who can be stored and who can be retrieved, and who might need to be disposed of, according to criteria that expand gradually until they include possibilities that were never part of the original architectural plan. And disposal, like every other fortress operation, becomes routine once the proper procedures are developed and the appropriate expertise is acquired, and the necessary equipment is installed and tested and proven reliable under operational conditions. Because machines, once perfected, tend to find applications beyond their original specifications, and the machine that Mehmed built to solve problems has grown efficient enough to solve problems that Mehmed never imagined, and sophisticated enough to solve them quietly enough that history might never record exactly what problems were solved or how the solutions were implemented. History only records that solutions were found, and found repeatedly, and found efficiently enough that the problems stopped being problems and the solutions stopped requiring explanation. Until the day when the problem that needs solving is wearing a crown. The boots echo differently when they come for a sultan. Not the measured cadence of routine patrol or the hurried shuffle of emergency response, but something harder and more deliberate. The sound of men who have crossed a line that can never be uncrossed and know that everything depends on completing what they've started before anyone has time to think about what they've begun. May 19, 1622. The date appears in 17 different chronicles recorded by witnesses who understand they are watching the empire tear itself apart in real time. But the chronicles disagree about details, because details require proximity to events that most people are wise enough to observe from a considerable distance. What the chronicles agree on is movement, bodies in motion through Constantinople's streets, the Janissary barracks emptying before dawn, palace guards abandoning their posts without orders, crowds gathering at intersections and then dispersing, when they realize that gathering might be interpreted as taking sides in a conflict where the wrong side could prove fatal. Osman II awakes to the sound of his own empire turning against him. 24 years old, Sultan for 3 years, dead by sunset. The mathematics of political violence compressed into a single day that will reshape the relationship between rulers and ruled for the next 3 centuries. The Janissaries move with the precision of a military operation because it is a military operation, not a revolution, not a popular uprising, not the chaotic eruption of mob violence. A calculated seizure of state power executed by professional soldiers who have identified a problem with the existing command structure and implemented a permanent solution. The problem is money. Always money. The Janissaries are owed back pay that the treasury cannot provide without raising taxes that the population cannot afford, without creating unrest that the government cannot suppress, without deploying military forces that cannot be deployed, because they are demanding the back pay that started the entire cycle. But the deeper problem is reform. Osman II has developed ideas about military modernization that threaten the traditional arrangements between the palace and the armed forces. Ideas about merit-based promotion instead of seniority-based advancement. Ideas about performance standards that might eliminate soldiers whose primary qualification is longevity rather than competence. Ideas about reducing the political influence of military units that have grown accustomed to treating sultans as employees rather than employers. The Janissaries understand that reform begins with compromise and ends with unemployment. Their solution demonstrates clarity of thinking that political scientists will study for centuries. Eliminate the reformer before the reform eliminates them. Urban logistics of a coup require coordination that reveals the sophistication of the planning. Crowds must be controlled without appearing to be controlled. Traffic must be directed without appearing to be directed. Communication must be maintained between multiple units operating in different parts of the city without using channels that might be monitored by palace intelligence services. The Janissaries solve these problems by converting routine military activities into revolutionary infrastructure. Normal patrol routes become deployment corridors. Standard communication protocols become coordination mechanisms. Regular training exercises become rehearsals for operations that no training manual describes. By noon, the city belongs to the army. By evening, the army belongs to whoever can promise the soldiers what they want, more than they want loyalty to a sultan who cannot afford to pay them. The seizure itself takes place in the palace, but the destination has already been determined. Not execution in public, which would create martyrdom and political complications. Not imprisonment in the palace, which would allow for rescue attempts and political negotiations. Transport to a location designed for containing problems until the problems can be resolved permanently and quietly. The route from palace to fortress follows streets that empty as the procession approaches and refill after it passes. Constantinopolitans have learned through centuries of experience with political instability that witnessing historical events can be hazardous to your health. History remembers participants. History forgets observers who are wise enough to observe from behind closed doors. But architectural details are harder to forget than human witnesses. The palace gates that open for the procession. The bridge across the Golden Horn that carries the party toward the walls. The narrow streets that funnel the movement into predetermined channels where control can be maintained and complications can be managed. The same route used for treasure transport. The same protocols used for diplomatic prisoners. The same procedures used for problems that require specialized handling by personnel trained in the administrative aspects of permanent solutions. Osman II enters Yedikul as a political prisoner. He will never leave as anything else. The cell prepared for this possibility is not the worst cell in the fortress. Not the dampest, not the darkest, not the most isolated. Ottoman political theory, like Ottoman architecture, operates on principles of calculated precision rather than crude brutality. The imprisonment of a sultan requires dignity sufficient to prevent immediate martyrdom, and conditions harsh enough to discourage extended resistance. But dignity, in the context of political imprisonment, becomes its own form of torture. A sultan accustomed to absolute authority discovers that authority exists only as long as people choose to recognize it. Remove the palace, the guards, the ceremony, the constant confirmation of power and authority reveals itself to be nothing more than collective agreement that can be withdrawn as easily as it was granted. The cell contains a bed, a table, writing materials, adequate lighting, everything necessary to maintain the illusion that this is temporary detention rather than terminal containment, everything necessary to sustain hope, long enough for hope to become the most cruel aspect of the entire process. Because hope requires time, and time, in this context, serves the purposes of the captors rather than the captive. The Janissaries need legitimacy for what they've done. Legitimacy requires legal justification for deposing a sultan who committed no crimes other than threatening their financial interests and political influence. Legal justification requires evidence of unfitness for rule, and evidence requires time to manufacture, time to develop charges, time to gather testimony, time to create documentation that transforms revolution into legal procedure and political violence into administrative process. But legal procedure, even manufactured legal procedure, creates records. And records create witnesses. And witnesses create the possibility that someone someday might ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between legal process and political convenience. The solution demonstrates the same administrative creativity that makes diplomatic imprisonment so effective. Eliminate the legal process without eliminating the appearance of legal process. Create the documentation without creating the evidence. Provide the justification without providing the details. The bowstring arrives at midnight, carried by men whose names are not recorded and whose faces are covered and whose families will receive compensation that ensures their continued silence about services rendered to the state under exceptional circumstances. Strangulation with a bowstring represents technical expertise refined through generations of Ottoman experience with political termination. No blood, no visible wounds, no evidence of struggle that might suggest torture or brutality. Death that appears peaceful from a distance and leaves bodies that can be displayed without raising questions about treatment during imprisonment. The technique requires skill that comes only from practice. Too much pressure creates visible trauma. Too little pressure allows for recovery, and the complications that recovery creates when the intended outcome is permanent resolution. The correct application of force requires timing, positioning, and expertise that transforms killing into craft. But craft, like every other aspect of fortress operations, requires tools that are maintained according to schedules that ensure operational reliability. Bowstrings tested for tensile strength, replacement equipment stored in controlled access areas, backup systems available in case primary equipment fails during implementation. Because equipment failure during political assassination creates the kind of administrative complications that might require explanation to supervisors who prefer to receive reports about successful completion rather than requests for additional resources to complete operations that should have been completed successfully the first time. The body is discovered the next morning by guards who report death from natural causes brought on by the stress of imprisonment and the poor health that results from the burden of ruling an empire during difficult times. The medical examination, performed by physicians who understand that their continued employment depends on reaching conclusions consistent with political necessity, confirms that Sultan Osman II died peacefully in his sleep. The bowstring disappears into administrative routine. The guards who reported the discovery are reassigned to other duties that take them away from Constantinople and the possibility of casual conversation about their observations. The physicians who perform the examination receive compensation that ensures their continued availability for similar services and their continued discretion about the nature of those services. The fortress returns to normal operations as if nothing unusual has happened. Because from the perspective of fortress operations, nothing unusual has happened. A prisoner arrived, was processed according to standard procedures, and achieved the resolution that the system was designed to provide. The only unusual aspect of this particular case is the political significance of the prisoner. But political significance is a palace concern, not a fortress concern. Fortress concerns are limited to operational questions. Was the containment secure? Was the resolution clean? Was the documentation complete? Was the disposal efficient? All operational questions receive satisfactory answers. The system performed exactly as designed. But systems that perform exactly as designed create their own problems. Success breeds confidence. Confidence encourages expanded application. Expanded application leads to mission creep that gradually transforms emergency procedures into routine solutions and exceptional measures into standard operating procedure. The fortress learns that it can contain any problem, solve any crisis, resolve any complication that can be reduced to a logistics question about transport, processing, and disposal. This knowledge becomes institutional capacity. Institutional capacity becomes organizational capability. Organizational capability becomes the preferred solution for problems that might previously have been addressed through negotiation, compromise, or political accommodation. Why negotiate when you can disappear? Why compromise when you can eliminate? Why accommodate opposition when you can transform opposition into absence? The arithmetic of political violence becomes elegantly simple. Subtract the problem, add the solution, balance the equation by ensuring that witnesses become participants and participants become invested in the success of the system that has made their participation necessary. Because the most effective systems are the ones that make opposition to the system feel like opposition to yourself. And the most efficient systems are the ones that make everyone complicit in their operation, creating shared responsibility that makes individual accountability impossible to assign and individual resistance impossible to sustain. The immediate aftermath requires damage control that reveals the sophistication of Ottoman crisis management. Scapegoats must be identified, blamed, and eliminated before they can provide testimony that contradicts official explanations. Documents must be revised to ensure consistency with approved narratives. Witnesses must be relocated, compensated, or resolved according to their level of cooperation with administrative requirements. The Grand Vizier, whose signature authorizes the policies that created the financial crisis that motivated the military intervention, discovers that authorization carries risks that extend beyond the duration of his appointment. His removal from office includes removal from the possibility of future testimony about the decision-making process that led to circumstances requiring permanent resolution. The Janissary officers who planned and executed the operation receive promotions that move them to distant provinces, where their expertise can be applied to local problems, and their knowledge about Constantinople operations can be diluted by time and distance and new responsibilities that require their full attention. The palace officials who facilitated access to the Sultan receive new assignments that take them away from court and into administrative positions, where their experience with crisis management can be useful without being dangerous, and their loyalty can be rewarded without their knowledge becoming a liability. Everyone who knows too much discovers that knowing too much is a career risk that can be managed through geographic relocation, role reassignment, and compensation packages that make forgetting more profitable than remembering. But the most elegant aspect of the damage control is its transparency. Nothing is hidden. Everything is documented. The transfers, the promotions, the reassignments, the compensation. All of it appears in official records as routine administrative housekeeping that reflects the empire's commitment to efficient governance and responsible personnel management. The cover-up operates in plain sight because the most effective cover-ups are the ones that look like everything except cover-ups. They look like reform, improvement, modernization, organizational development. They look like the natural evolution of administrative systems that are constantly adapting to changing circumstances and improving their capacity to serve imperial interests. And serving imperial interests, once a sultan has been eliminated for threatening those interests, means ensuring that future sultans understand the relationship between reform and risk, between innovation and instability, between leadership and longevity. The lesson is simple. Political power operates only with the consent of the people who control the mechanisms of political violence. That consent can be withdrawn at any time, for any reason, using procedures that transform resistance into absence and absence into administrative routine. The fortress that was built to protect sovereignty has become the place where sovereignty learns the limits of its authority. And those limits, once established, become permanent features of the political landscape that shape imperial policy for centuries. Because machines, once they prove their effectiveness, tend to expand their area of operation, and the machine that can eliminate a sultan can eliminate anyone. Which means that everyone, no matter how powerful, eventually becomes subject to the operational parameters of a system that recognizes no authority higher than its own continued functioning. The empire that began by conquering territory ends by conquering itself. And conquest, like every other form of violence, eventually becomes routine. The blood never quite washes away. Not from the stones, not from the ledgers, not from the institutional memory that transforms exceptional violence into administrative precedent. Once a fortress learns to kill royalty, every subsequent death becomes a variation on a proven theme rather than an innovation requiring careful consideration. The decades following Osman II's strangulation establish patterns that will define Ottoman statecraft for the remainder of the empire's existence. The fortress expands its operational scope systematically, methodically, with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that treats human elimination as a quality control process, requiring continuous improvement and expanded application. 1648. Prince Qasim, brother to the reigning sultan, arrives at Yedikul, accused of plotting against the throne. The evidence is circumstantial, the testimony is coerced, the trial is perfunctory, but the administrative procedures are flawless. Document review, witness interviews, legal consultation, medical examination, disposal protocol, cleanup operations, and final reporting all completed according to standards that would satisfy any audit. Prince Qasim dies of natural causes. Heart failure brought on by the stress of imprisonment and the poor health that results from living under constant suspicion of treason. The physicians who examine the body find no evidence of violence. The guards who managed his detention report no unusual incidents. The administrators who processed his case file proper documentation that demonstrates strict adherence to legal requirements and humanitarian standards. The bowstring that killed him disappears into inventory management. The men who used it receive performance evaluations that note their professionalism, discretion, and reliability under challenging circumstances. The supervisors who authorize the operation receive commendations for efficient problem resolution and effective resource utilization. 1687. The Venetian ambassador, whose government refuses to accept Ottoman terms for territorial concessions in the Aegean, discovers that diplomatic immunity has limitations that were not covered in his training. His imprisonment begins with ceremony appropriate to his status. Comfortable quarters, excellent meals, access to secretaries and translators, permission to correspond with his government about ongoing negotiations. But comfort, when applied systematically, becomes its own form of pressure. The ambassador's quarters shrink gradually. His meals arrive on increasingly irregular schedules. His correspondence privileges are suspended pending review of security considerations that are never quite resolved. His requests for clarification about the duration of his detention receive responses that are always courteous and never quite informative. 6 months later, the ambassador dies in his sleep. Natural causes, according to the medical examination. Heart failure brought on by the accumulated stress of extended diplomatic isolation and the poor health that results from inadequate nutrition and insufficient exercise. Venice receives formal notification of his death, along with expressions of condolence and assurances that his personal effects will be returned, according to established diplomatic protocol. Venice does not send a replacement ambassador. 1703. The chief tax collector for the European provinces, whose ledgers reveal discrepancies between collected revenues and delivered payments that amount to approximately 2 million gold akçes, arrives at Yedikule for financial review and administrative consultation. The review process requires access to detailed records that must be examined in secure facilities that prevent unauthorized disclosure of sensitive fiscal information. The examination reveals evidence of systematic embezzlement, fraudulent reporting, and conspiracy with provincial officials to defraud the imperial treasury. The evidence is comprehensive, well documented, and compelling. The chief tax collector confesses to all charges and provides detailed testimony about the scope of his criminal activities and the identity of his co-conspirators. He dies before the investigation can be completed. Suicide, according to the guards who discover his body. Hanging, using bed sheets fashioned into rope in a moment of despair brought on by guilt and fear of public disgrace. The suicide note, written in his own hand, accepts full responsibility for his crimes and expresses remorse for betraying the trust placed in him by the Sultan and the empire. The 2 million gold akshis are never recovered. The co-conspirators identified in his testimony are reassigned to positions in distant provinces where their expertise in provincial administration can be applied to local problems that require immediate attention and full-time commitment. Each case establishes precedents that make subsequent cases easier to justify and more efficient to process. The legal frameworks that legitimize imprisonment become more flexible. The medical standards that define natural death become more accommodating. The administrative procedures that govern disposal become more streamlined. But the most significant development is the fortress's evolution from reactive problem-solving to proactive risk management. Instead of waiting for problems to manifest before implementing solutions, the system begins identifying potential problems and implementing preemptive solutions that prevent problems from developing to the point where they require more dramatic intervention. 1721. The Imam of the Fatih Mosque, whose Friday sermons include criticism of imperial policy regarding taxation of religious properties, receives an invitation to the palace for theological consultation about complex legal questions requiring scholarly expertise. The consultation takes place at Yedikule because the sensitive nature of the questions requires secure facilities that prevent unauthorized access to confidential deliberations. The Imam arrives on Tuesday evening. By Thursday morning, the theological questions have been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The Imam's scholarly contributions to the deliberations are recognized and appreciated. His insights prove valuable for developing policy recommendations that will serve the empire's long-term interests. Friday's sermon at the Fatih Mosque is delivered by a replacement imam whose theological understanding aligns more closely with imperial policy regarding the proper relationship between religious authority and state authority. The congregation is informed that the previous imam has been reassigned to scholarly duties that require his full attention and prevent him from continuing his preaching responsibilities. The replacement imam's sermons focus on themes of obedience, loyalty, and the religious obligation to support legitimate authority even when that authority makes decisions that are difficult to understand from the perspective of ordinary believers who lack access to the information that informs imperial decision-making. 1734. The guildmaster of the Constantinople bakers, whose organization coordinates resistance to wheat price controls that make profitable bread production impossible without violating quality standards enforced by imperial inspectors, receives a summons for economic consultation about market conditions and pricing policy. The consultation reveals that resistance to price controls constitutes economic treason that threatens the stability of urban food supplies and the public order that depends on affordable bread prices. The guildmaster acknowledges his misunderstanding of the economic principles that govern imperial pricing policy and agrees to cooperate with measures designed to ensure market stability. He dies during the consultation. Heart attack brought on by the shock of realizing the severity of his economic crimes and the magnitude of their potential impact on imperial stability. His last words, recorded by witnesses present during the consultation, express remorse for his resistance to policies designed to protect the common good and gratitude for the opportunity to understand his mistakes before they cause irreparable harm to the empire. The Bakers' Guild receives new leadership that demonstrates better understanding of the economic principles that govern imperial pricing policy and greater commitment to cooperation with measures designed to ensure market stability and public order. The pattern becomes self-reinforcing. Each successful application of fortress-based problem resolution creates institutional knowledge that makes future applications more efficient and politically acceptable. Each eliminated problem creates space for identifying new problems that might benefit from similar solutions. Each precedent establishes legal and administrative frameworks that make similar precedents easier to create. The fortress develops specialized expertise in different types of problems: political problems requiring discretion and sophisticated cover stories, economic problems requiring financial documentation and market impact assessment, religious problems requiring theological justification and replacement personnel, diplomatic problems requiring international communication and protocol management. Each specialty requires different tools, different procedures, different documentation standards, and different disposal protocols. But all specialties share common features: controlled access, limited witnesses, comprehensive cleanup, and administrative processes that transform exceptional violence into routine problem resolution. The efficiency gains are measurable. By 1750, the average time from problem identification to resolution is 6 weeks. By 1780, it's 3 weeks. By 1800, it's 10 days. The system learns to process problems faster, more quietly, and with less political fallout. But efficiency creates its own problems. Success breeds confidence. Confidence encourages expanded application. Expanded application leads to the kind of mission creep that gradually transforms emergency procedures into standard operating practice and exceptional measures into routine administrative tools. The fortress that began as a last resort becomes a first response. The procedures that were designed for extreme circumstances become applicable to moderate circumstances. The standards that justified terminal solutions for existential threats become standards that justify terminal solutions for manageable annoyances. The economics of controlled suffering create perverse incentives that reward problem identification and punish problem resolution through methods that don't require fortress involvement. Why negotiate with difficult personalities when elimination is faster and more permanent? Why tolerate criticism when silence can be purchased for the cost of transportation and processing? But the most dangerous development is the fortress's gradual independence from external oversight. Success creates trust. Trust reduces supervision. Reduced supervision creates opportunities for operational expansion beyond authorized parameters. Operational expansion creates institutional interests that may not align perfectly with imperial interests. The fortress develops its own budget, its own personnel policies, its own procurement procedures, its own quality control standards. It becomes a state within the state, serving imperial interests when imperial interests align with fortress interests and serving fortress interests when they don't. And fortress interests, like all institutional interests, tend toward self-preservation and expansion rather than self-limitation and accountability. The irony is elegant and terrible. The machine built to solve the empire's problems eventually becomes the empire's most dangerous problem. But it's a problem that can't be solved using the empire's most effective problem-solving tool, because the tool has become the problem. The fortress that was designed to contain threats to imperial authority has become a threat to imperial authority that cannot be contained by any mechanism more powerful than itself. Which means that imperial authority, like everything else in the empire, eventually becomes subject to fortress authority. And fortress authority, unlike imperial authority, doesn't depend on ceremony or tradition or legitimacy. It depends only on operational capacity and the willingness to use that capacity when circumstances require permanent solutions to temporary problems. The empire discovers that building the perfect prison eventually requires imprisoning the empire itself. And escape, once the bars are in place and the guards are trained and the procedures are established, becomes impossible even for the people who designed the system in the first place. Because the best systems are the ones that continue operating even after their creators realize they've created something more powerful than themselves. And power, once institutionalized, becomes independent of the people who created it and autonomous from the purposes it was created to serve. The fortress endures. The empire that built it does not.